Sir,
leave the cabin now!
you're going to need to leave first class. Captain Renata Kessler never looked at his reservation. She looked at the Hells Angels patch on his leather vest and decided she already knew who he was. Less than 10 seconds later, she ordered a single father and his 10-year-old daughter off the airplane. By the time 40 passengers started recording, it was already too late. His daughter was still holding his hand. His boarding pass was completely valid, and Captain Kessler had no idea she was humiliating the brand new CEO of the airline in front of his own passengers. Before this day ended, one boarding decision would change an entire airline. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. The cabin door stood open, and Captain Renata Kessler's hand was already pointing toward it. Her voice carried through first class with the confidence of someone who had never expected to be questioned. The man in the leather vest needed to leave. Now. Kyle Briggs never raised his voice. Beside him, his 10-year-old daughter clutched a worn stuffed dog against her chest and stared at the carpet, wishing she could disappear into it. Kyle simply held out his boarding pass again. "Check the system one more time," he said. That was all he asked. Hours earlier, before the aircraft, before the confrontation, before dozens of cell phones began recording, the morning had belonged to a father, his daughter, and a crowded terminal at Denver International Airport. Kyle stood beside the windows at Gate B14 with a paper cup of cooling coffee in one hand and Nora's backpack hanging from his shoulder. His black leather Hells Angels vest rested over a faded gray shirt, the patches stitched neatly across the front and back. The leather showed years of use, but meticulous care. His jeans were worn, his boots were polished. He wasn't dressed to impress anyone. He was dressed exactly the way he had dressed long before anyone knew his name in the airline industry, and exactly the way he still dressed after becoming Summit Pacific Airlines' new controlling owner and chief executive 2 weeks earlier. He had promised the board one thing before accepting the position. He would experience his own airline exactly as every other passenger did. No assistance, no executive security, no priority notifications. No employee would know who he was until he chose to tell them. Beside him, Nora sat cross-legged in a terminal chair, quietly watching travelers hurry toward their gates. She had inherited her mother's habit of noticing small things. "Dad." Kyle looked over. "That man keeps showing them his ID." Near the counter, an elderly man wearing a thin gray cardigan stood patiently while a gate agent examined his driver's license for the 3rd time. The man answered every question politely while 2 younger passengers in tailored business suits were waved through with barely a glance. Most people never noticed moments like that. Kyle did. For nearly a year, Summit Pacific's customer complaint files had told the same story. Passengers questioned because of how they looked. Travelers delayed because someone decided they didn't belong. Every complaint sounded insignificant by itself. Together, they painted a pattern. That pattern was why Kyle had bought this ticket himself instead of flying on the company's executive aircraft. "Dad?" Nora looked up again. "Is he in trouble?" Kyle watched the older man accept his license back with a tired smile. "No. He didn't do anything wrong." "Then why do they keep stopping him?" Kyle didn't want to teach his daughter about prejudice in an airport terminal. Instead, he gave her the smallest piece of the truth. Sometimes people decide who someone is before they know anything about them. Nora frowned. "That's not fair." "No, it isn't." The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. First-class passengers were invited to board. Kyle picked up Nora's backpack. She slipped her small hand into his without being asked. and together they walked down the jet bridge. At the aircraft door, a flight attendant named Priya greeted them with a professional smile. Her expression changed the instant she noticed Kyle's vest. Her eyes lingered on the Hells Angels patch, then on his boots, then on Nora. Only after that did she reach for his boarding pass. The scanner flashed green. Seat 2A. Confirmed. Everything exactly as it should have been. She handed the pass back politely. But when the sharply dressed couple behind Kyle stepped forward, her smile became noticeably warmer. Kyle caught the difference. He said nothing. As he and Nora walked down the aisle, he noticed something else. A middle-aged passenger glanced at the Hells Angels patch and quietly pulled his briefcase closer. A woman across the aisle looked at Nora, then back at Kyle before whispering something to her husband. Neither interaction lasted more than a few seconds. Neither was openly hostile. Both said exactly the same thing. People had already decided what kind of man he was. Kyle had spent enough years wearing that vest to recognize the look. He simply kept walking. He helped Nora settle into the window seat beside him. She immediately pressed her hand against the glass, smiling as another aircraft taxied toward the runway. For a few peaceful moments, none of the complaint files mattered. None of the whispered assumptions mattered. He wasn't the owner of an airline. He wasn't a chief executive. He wasn't a Hells Angel. He was simply a father flying with his little girl. Then the cockpit door opened. Captain Renata Kessler stepped into the aisle. Kyle watched her greet several passengers with practiced confidence. She nodded politely to a businessman in row 2C. She smiled at a couple seated across the aisle. Then her eyes stopped on the leather vest. The smile disappeared. Kyle recognized that look immediately. He had seen it in restaurants, hotels, hospitals, school events, board meetings. It always lasted less than a second. And it always led to the same question. What is someone like him doing here? Without saying a word, Captain Kessler turned toward the galley and quietly called Priya over. Their conversation lasted only a few moments. Kyle couldn't hear a single word. He didn't need to. He had seen people make decisions about him before they ever introduced themselves. He had a feeling he was about to watch it happen again. If you've ever been judged before someone learned your name, comment "I see you" below. This story is for everyone who's ever been told they didn't belong before anyone bothered to find out who they really were. Captain Renata Kessler stepped into the first-class cabin with the quiet confidence of someone completely at home in command. 4 captain stripes rested neatly on her shoulders, her cap tucked beneath one arm as she made her customary walk through the cabin before departure. She greeted passengers with practiced ease, a nod to the businessman in 2C, a smile for the couple across the aisle, a brief greeting for a frequent flyer she recognized. Then she reached row 2. Her eyes found Kyle Briggs. Not his face, his leather vest, the large Hells Angels patch across his back, the worn backpack beneath the seat, the work boots. Then Nora sitting quietly beside him with a stuffed dog in her lap. Renata stopped for only a fraction of a second. To anyone else, it would have looked like nothing. To Kyle, it was familiar. She had already reached a conclusion. In 14 years of flying, Captain Kessler had developed an image of who belonged in first class. Corporate executives, professionals, celebrities, military officers, families with expensive luggage. The man wearing a Hells Angels vest wasn't part of that picture. She turned without introducing herself. Walking back toward the galley, she quietly motioned Priya closer. The flight attendant leaned in. Renata kept her voice low. "Can you verify the gentleman in 2A?" Priya frowned. His boarding pass scanned normally. "I'd like you to check again." "You think there's an issue?" I'd like to be certain. Priya hesitated, only briefly. Then she nodded. Kyle watched the conversation from several rows away. He couldn't hear the words. He recognized the body language. People often believed they whispered quietly enough. They rarely did. The conversation wasn't really hidden. It was simply polite enough to avoid confrontation. A minute later, Priya returned. Her expression carried an apology before she spoke. "Sir?" Kyle looked up with an easy smile. "Could I see your boarding pass one more time?" Nora turned away from the window. Kyle reached into his vest pocket. "Of course." He handed it over without hesitation. Priya scanned it again. The screen flashed green. Seat 2A. Kyle Briggs. Confirmed. Exactly as before. She studied the scanner a moment longer. Nothing changed. No warning. No duplicate booking. No alert. She thanked him quietly before walking back toward the captain. Kyle noticed another passenger watching the exchange. Then another. The businessman across the aisle lowered his tablet. The woman who had whispered earlier looked toward Kyle's vest again. A younger passenger near the bulkhead discreetly lifted his phone, pretending to check messages while watching everything unfold. Captain Kessler accepted the scanner from Priya. She studied the display. Nothing supported what she had expected to find. For a brief moment, she could have ended the situation. She could have accepted that the passenger belonged exactly where he was sitting. Instead, she handed the scanner back. Then she made a decision. She placed her cap on the galley counter and walked deliberately toward row 2. She stopped beside Kyle's seat. "Mr. Briggs." She pronounced his name carefully, almost cautiously. "I'm Captain Renata Kessler." Kyle nodded politely. "Captain, I'm afraid we've encountered a problem with your reservation." "A problem?" "Our system appears to be showing a conflict." Kyle looked at her without changing expression. "What kind of conflict?" "A duplicate reservation." She folded her hands neatly in front of her. "It happens occasionally." Her tone suggested it rarely happened to people who looked like him. "I'm going to ask you to collect your belongings." She glanced toward Nora. "You and your daughter can return to the gate while our agents resolve the issue." Nora's hand immediately found her father's sleeve. The cabin changed. Conversations stopped. The businessman in 2C lowered his tablet completely. Someone removed an earbud. Another passenger quietly locked their laptop. Every eye drifted toward row 2. Kyle already knew exactly what his reservation showed. He had booked the ticket himself. He had watched the confirmation email arrive. He had checked in online. He had scanned successfully at the gate. Twice. There wasn't a duplicate booking. There wasn't a reservation conflict. There was only a captain who had looked at a Hells Angels patch before looking at the reservation record. Kyle slowly reached into his vest pocket again and held out the boarding pass. "My ticket scanned correctly at the gate." He smiled politely. "It scanned correctly a moment ago." He looked directly at Captain Kessler. "If the system is showing a conflict, would you mind pulling the reservation record so we can both see it?" The request caught her completely off guard. She hadn't expected him to know airline procedure. She certainly hadn't expected him to ask for documentation. For the first time since leaving the cockpit, Captain Kessler realized the man in the leather vest wasn't reacting the way she had predicted. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't intimidated. He simply wanted her to prove what she had claimed. And for reasons she couldn't yet explain. That unsettled her more than any raised voice ever could. Captain Kessler held Kyle's boarding pass for another moment before handing it back. Her jaw tightened. She had expected confusion, perhaps an argument, maybe even anger. Instead, the man wearing the Hell's Angels vest had calmly asked for something she hadn't expected. Proof. "That's not necessary," she said. Kyle slid the boarding pass back into his vest pocket. "If the reservation shows a conflict, the record will explain it. Our agents will handle that at the gate." "They can." He nodded. "But you can verify it right here." Captain Kessler folded her arms. "My responsibility is to keep this flight on schedule." Kyle met her eyes. "Then let's solve the problem instead of moving it." For the first time, irritation crossed her face. She wasn't accustomed to having her decisions questioned, especially not in front of a cabin full of passengers. The system isn't something passengers review. "I agree." Kyle's voice remained steady. "But crew members do." Silence. "If it's a duplicate reservation, there'll be a reservation history." Another silence. "There'll be a record number." He paused. "Pull it." The businessman across the aisle lowered his tablet onto his lap. The elderly gentleman in the gray cardigan stopped pretending to read his magazine. Even Priya shifted uneasily near the galley. Nobody spoke. The conversation wasn't getting louder. It was getting harder to ignore. Captain Kessler drew a slow breath. "I'm not going to debate company policy with you. I'm not asking you to." Kyle smiled politely. "I'm asking you to verify the facts before removing a paying passenger." Nora looked down at the stuffed dog in her lap. She didn't understand reservation records. She didn't understand airline procedures. She only understood that everyone around them had stopped talking. "Dad?" Kyle looked at her. "Are we leaving?" "We're waiting for Captain Kessler to check something." "But they already checked." His smile softened. "I know." Captain Kessler heard every word. For an instant, uncertainty flickered across her face. Then pride pushed it aside. She had earned 4 captain's stripes. She wasn't about to let a biker challenge her authority in front of 40 passengers. "Mr. Briggs," she said coolly, "if you continue refusing my instructions, I'll have to involve airport security." Kyle didn't react. "If security comes," he replied, "they'll ask the same question I'm asking." "What question?" "What lawful reason do you have for removing a confirmed passenger?" The words settled over the cabin. No one reached for a drink. No one checked a phone. Even the usual rustle of boarding had disappeared. Priya glanced toward the captain, then quietly looked away. Captain Kessler noticed. She also noticed something else. Passengers weren't looking at Kyle anymore. They were looking at her. That bothered her more than she wanted to admit. "This conversation is finished." Kyle inclined his head respectfully. "It ends the moment the reservation record is opened. I don't need your permission." "You don't." "Then collect your belongings." Kyle remained seated. His hands rested calmly on his knees. "If the record says I'm in the wrong seat," he glanced briefly around first class, "I'll apologize to everyone on this aircraft before I leave." No one moved. "But if it doesn't..." He allowed the sentence to trail away. He didn't need to finish it. Every passenger already understood what he meant. Captain Kessler slowly looked around the cabin. People were watching, waiting. Not for Kyle. For her. She hated that feeling. She looked toward the computer terminal near the galley. For one brief moment, she considered walking over and pulling the reservation history. It would take less than 30 seconds. If the system supported her, the conversation would end. If it didn't, she refused to finish that thought. Instead, she reached toward the intercom mounted beside the aircraft door. Before her fingers touched it, Kyle spoke one last time. "Captain?" She stopped. "If you're certain I'm the problem." He looked directly into her eyes. "Prove it." The words lingered in the stillness. Then a phone unlocked. Another followed. A third appeared over the top of a seat. Within seconds, screens were quietly rising throughout first class. No one announced they were recording. They simply started. The atmosphere had changed. This was no longer a disagreement between a captain and a passenger. It had become something people wanted to remember. Nora noticed the phones before anyone else did. She moved a little closer to her father. Her voice barely carried. "Dad, why are they filming us?" Kyle gently brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. He smiled with the same calm she had trusted her whole life. "They're not filming us anymore, sweetheart." He looked once around the silent cabin. "They're filming the decision that comes next. If you've ever had someone judge you before learning your story, comment 'still standing' below. Your story deserves to be heard too." Captain Kessler's hand closed around the intercom handset. She looked from the raised phones back to Kyle Briggs. Any uncertainty that had crossed her face disappeared. "That's not how this works," she said. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who believed authority ended every argument. "I'm the captain of this aircraft. I don't debate operational decisions with passengers." Kyle nodded once. "I respect your position." "I'm not sure you do." "I do." He held her gaze. "What I don't understand is why you've refused to verify a reservation you claim has a conflict." "I've made my decision. And I've asked you to support it. I don't owe you an explanation." Kyle answered without hesitation. "You owe every passenger on this aircraft a lawful one." The sentence settled across first class. No one spoke. Captain Kessler lifted the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice calm and measured. "We're experiencing a delay because a passenger is refusing crew instructions. We'll depart as soon as the situation has been resolved." She returned the handset to its cradle. The announcement changed the mood immediately. Passengers who hadn't cared now had a reason to care. A businessman looked at his watch and sighed. Someone near the bulkhead muttered, "Unbelievable." Another passenger shook his head. "One guy's holding up the whole plane." Kyle heard it. So did Nora. She leaned against him. "Dad, they think it's us." Kyle squeezed her hand. "They only know one side of the story. But they're angry. They're frustrated." He smiled gently. "There's a difference." Several nearby passengers overheard him. A few looked uncomfortable. Others still avoided his eyes. Captain Kessler decided to press forward. "Kevin." The senior flight attendant stepped into the aisle immediately. Priya joined him a few feet behind. Neither spoke. They simply stood beside their captain. The message was clear. The crew had closed ranks. Kyle had seen the same thing in boardrooms. Once someone in authority committed to a decision, everyone around them often defended the position before they examined the facts. Kevin cleared his throat. "Sir." Kyle looked up. "I really think it would be best if you cooperated." Kyle asked one simple question. "You scanned my boarding pass?" "Yes." "It was valid?" "Yes." "You watched it scan green?" "Yes." Kyle nodded. "So, have you personally seen any evidence that my reservation has a conflict?" Kevin hesitated. His eyes drifted toward Captain Kessler. "I trust the captain." Kyle smiled politely. "I didn't ask who you trusted." He let the words settle. "I asked what you saw." Kevin couldn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, because he hadn't seen any evidence. Several passengers noticed the silence. The businessman who had complained earlier slowly lowered his phone. The woman who had whispered about Kyle's vest looked from Kevin back to Captain Kessler. The balance inside the cabin had begun to shift. Captain Kessler folded her arms. This discussion is over. Kyle remained calm. May I ask one last question? She didn't answer. He continued anyway. You've described this as a reservation conflict. Correct. You've ordered me to surrender a confirmed seat. Correct. You've delayed a commercial flight. Correct. Kyle inclined his head. Then let's be precise. He held up one finger. A duplicate reservation creates documentation. A second finger. A denied boarding requires a documented reason. A third. If the concern is safety, there should be evidence. A fourth. If the concern is the reservation history should support it. He lowered his hand. If neither exists, he looked directly at Captain Kessler. Then this isn't a reservation issue. It's a personal judgment. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Kyle continued with the same steady voice. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for equal treatment. He glanced around the cabin. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize to every passenger here. I'll leave this aircraft willingly. Then he looked back at Captain Kessler. But if I'm right... He stopped. The unfinished sentence carried more weight than any accusation. Passengers who had blamed the man in the Hells Angels vest only minutes earlier now found themselves asking a different question. Why wouldn't the captain simply pull the reservation record? Captain Kessler saw it happen. The looks, the hesitation, the growing doubt. Instead of strengthening her position, every refusal had weakened it. She reached for the intercom again, not to verify the reservation, to protect her authority. And in that moment, the cabin understood something Kyle had recognized much earlier. This had stopped being about a boarding pass. It had become a test of pride. If you've ever watched someone refuse to admit they were wrong, even when the truth was right in front of them, comment, truth wins. Sometimes pride is louder than facts, but facts always last longer. No one spoke. The silence inside first class felt different now. Only moments earlier, passengers had been watching a biker refuse to leave his seat. Now they were watching a captain refuse to prove she was right. Captain Renata Kessler felt the shift. She saw it in the lowered phones, the uncertain faces, the passengers who had stopped nodding in agreement. She had one opportunity left to end the confrontation. Walk to the terminal, open the reservation record, read it aloud. Instead, she doubled down. I don't care how familiar you are with airline policy, she said, her voice noticeably sharper. You're still refusing a direct instruction from the captain of this aircraft. Kyle remained seated. I'm refusing an unsupported accusation. You are refusing my authority. No. He shook his head. I'm asking you to exercise it properly. Before Captain Kessler could respond, a voice rose from 2 rows behind. Captain. The elderly gentleman in the gray cardigan slowly stood. The cabin recognized him immediately. He was the same man who had been repeatedly questioned at the gate. My name is Richard Holloway. His calm voice carried naturally through the quiet cabin. I flew commercial aircraft for 36 years. Several passengers turned toward him. I retired as a senior captain. He looked directly at Renata. I've handled weather diversions, emergency landings, unruly passengers, and legitimate boarding denials. He paused. This isn't one of them. Captain Kessler's expression remained firm. Sir, I'd appreciate it if you'd remain seated. I will. He nodded politely. When I've finished. No one interrupted him. A reservation conflict leaves evidence. It creates documentation. It creates a reservation history. He gestured toward Kyle. This gentleman has politely asked to see that documentation. His eyes returned to the captain. You've refused every opportunity to produce it. Before Renata could answer, another passenger stood. A woman in a Navy business suit lowered her phone. My name is Elena Vega. Her voice was composed and professional. I'm a civil rights attorney. Several passengers exchanged surprised glances. She raised her phone slightly. This recording includes every instruction you've given, every response Mr. Briggs has made, and every refusal to verify the reservation. She looked directly at Captain Kessler. I strongly recommend you reconsider what happens next. For one brief moment, the aircraft offered Renata a way back. Two respected professionals had given her room to correct the situation without losing her dignity. She refused it. I don't answer to passengers. Her voice cut through the cabin. I answer to the safety of this aircraft. She turned toward Kevin. Call airport security. Kevin hesitated. It lasted barely a second, but everyone noticed. Captain, I gave you an instruction. Yes, Captain. Before Kevin could reach the interphone, Renata picked up the cabin handset herself. This is Captain Kessler. Her voice echoed through the aircraft. I need airport security at the aircraft immediately. She paused. We have a passenger refusing repeated crew instructions. She returned the handset to its cradle. This time the cabin stayed completely quiet. No one complained about delays. No one blamed Kyle. They simply watched. Nora's small hand tightened around her father's. She had tried to be brave. She had listened. She had trusted him. Now the tears came anyway. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the quiet tears of a little girl who couldn't understand why everyone seemed determined to remove the kindest person she knew. Dad. Kyle immediately turned toward her. They're bringing security. I know. Are they taking us away? He gently wiped a tear from her cheek. No. But they said they are. I know what they said. Her voice cracked. Did we do something wrong? Kyle's heart sank. No, sweetheart. Then why won't they believe you? For the first time that day, Kyle didn't answer immediately, because there wasn't an answer a 10-year-old deserved to carry. Finally, he spoke. Sometimes people decide who you are before they decide what happened. Nora leaned against him. I don't want to stay anymore. Those 6 words settled everything. Kyle had boarded this flight to discover whether the complaints against his airline were isolated incidents or evidence of something larger. He had his answer. He had the false accusation. He had dozens of witnesses. He had multiple recordings. He had the testimony of a retired airline captain. He had the support of an attorney. Most importantly, he had seen what this experience had done to his daughter. No investigation was worth asking her to endure another minute. Kyle stood, not because Captain Kessler had ordered him to, because Nora needed her father more than Summit Pacific Airlines needed another piece of evidence. He lifted the worn backpack from beneath the seat. He smiled at his daughter. We're going. She looked up through tear-filled eyes. Because they made us? Kyle shook his head. No. He took her hand. Because I choose you. Together, they walked toward the aircraft door. Passengers quietly stepped aside. No one looked afraid anymore. Richard Holloway reached into his jacket pocket and handed Kyle a business card. If you decide this shouldn't end here, Kyle accepted it. I'll testify to everything I saw. Elena Vega offered a small smile. My contact information is attached to the recording. I'll do the same. Kyle thanked them both before stepping onto the jet bridge. Outside the aircraft, he settled Nora onto a quiet bench with a bottle of water. Only after making sure she had stopped crying did he step a short distance away and remove his phone. He made 3 calls. The first arranged a private charter to Chicago. The second was to the chairman of Summit Pacific Airlines. We're moving tonight's board meeting forward. The chairman heard something in Kyle's voice. What happened? Kyle looked back at Nora. I've just seen exactly what kind of airline we've become. He ended the call. Then he looked at Richard Holloway's business card. He dialed the number. When the retired captain answered, Kyle spoke only one sentence. I think it's time the people at the top saw what happened at the bottom. The Summit Pacific Airlines headquarters overlooked downtown Chicago through walls of glass. From the executive floor, the city appeared calm. Traffic moved. Airliners crossed the afternoon sky. Nothing outside suggested that one boarding decision had already begun changing the future of the airline. Inside the boardroom, 11 directors sat around a long, polished table. Some had built the company. Others represented major investors. Every one of them had received the same message. Emergency board meeting. Attendance required. No explanation. Only one instruction. Watch the recording before discussion begins. The room was unusually quiet. Normally, the directors talked business before a meeting. Today, they watched a paused video on the large screen. The image was frozen on Captain Renata Kessler. One arm extended down the aisle, one finger pointing toward the aircraft door. At the head of the table sat Kyle Briggs. The leather vest was gone. In its place was a charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, a simple navy tie. Nothing about him resembled the biker Captain Kessler had judged, except his eyes. They carried the same calm they had carried aboard Flight 417. The board members occasionally glanced toward him. None of them spoke. They understood this meeting wasn't about one passenger complaint. A quiet knock interrupted the silence. An executive assistant stepped inside. Captain Kessler has arrived. Kyle nodded. Please send her in. A moment later, the conference room door opened. Renata entered wearing the same immaculate captain's uniform. 4 bright stripes, cap beneath one arm, back perfectly straight. She had spent the drive convincing herself this meeting was routine. A difficult passenger, a complaint, some paperwork, an explanation. Then she looked toward the head of the table. Everything stopped. The face, the calm expression, the man she'd ordered off her airplane, Kyle Briggs. For several long seconds, her mind refused to connect the leather vest to the tailored suit. Then it did. The color drained from her face. The room remained completely silent. Kyle stood, not to intimidate her, simply out of courtesy. Good afternoon, Captain Kessler. His voice hadn't changed. It was the same calm voice that had asked her to verify the reservation. Please have a seat. She couldn't answer. Every explanation she had prepared disappeared. Kyle waited. I think this conversation should begin with the facts. He nodded toward the screen. The recording began. Every person in the room watched. No one interrupted. The second boarding pass scan. The accusation. The repeated request to pull the reservation record. The whispered comments about the man in the Hells Angels vest. The first passengers raising their phones. Richard Holloway calmly explaining airline procedure. Elena Vega identifying herself as an attorney. The request for airport security. Nora asking her father if they had done something wrong. Kyle choosing to leave instead of forcing his daughter to endure any more humiliation. When the recording ended, no one spoke. Captain Kessler stared at the dark screen. Watching herself from outside the situation felt very different than living through it. Kyle folded his hands. I want to make one thing clear. His eyes moved around the table. This isn't one bad morning. The directors listened. If it were, we would discipline one captain, settle one complaint, issue one apology, and move on. He slowly shook his head. But that's not what happened. He leaned forward. I boarded that aircraft because our complaint files have been telling the same story for years. Passengers judged before they were helped. Travelers delayed because someone decided they didn't belong. Customers treated differently because appearance replaced evidence. He looked briefly toward Renata. You didn't create that culture. You exposed it. Silence filled the room. You looked at a leather vest. You saw a Hell's Angels patch. You decided you already knew the man wearing it. His voice remained calm. You never verified the reservation because the patch told you the story you wanted to believe. Several directors quietly lowered their eyes. Kyle continued, I refuse to believe this begins and ends with Captain Kessler. He turned toward the board. I want every complaint involving discriminatory treatment over the last 6 years reviewed. Pens immediately began moving. Not by our legal department, not by human resources, not by anyone employed by Summit Pacific Airlines. He paused. I want an independent review. The room grew even quieter. Every boarding denial, every complaint involving bias, every employee connected to repeated allegations. If we have patterns, we confront them. If we have failures, we correct them. If we ignored passengers who trusted us enough to tell us the truth, we admit it publicly. He looked around the room one final time. The reputation of an airline isn't built in this boardroom. It's built one passenger at a time. And if the least powerful person boarding one of our airplanes can't expect fairness, he let the sentence settle, then none of us deserves the privilege of leading this company. No one disagreed. One by one, the directors nodded. The chairman spoke first. I move that we authorize an independent 6-year review effective immediately. Another director spoke. Second. The vote was unanimous. Without debate. Without hesitation. The first decision of Kyle Briggs' leadership had nothing to do with profits. It had everything to do with trust. And for the first time since she had walked into the room, Captain Renata Kessler realized the man she had dismissed because of a leather vest hadn't come there to embarrass her. He had come to change an entire airline. The boardroom remained silent long after the vote. No one rushed toward the next agenda item. No one reached for a phone. The recording had changed the room. Captain Renata Kessler sat motionless, her hands folded tightly together. The confidence she had carried onto Flight 417 was gone. For the first time in 14 years, she wasn't thinking like a captain. She was thinking like a passenger watching herself from another seat. Kyle didn't speak immediately. He had no interest in humiliating her. Humiliation had created enough damage already. He believed every person deserved one chance to tell the truth before someone else spoke for them. Finally, Renata lifted her eyes. I've replayed that flight in my head ever since I left Denver. Her voice was quieter than anyone in the room had ever heard it. I kept telling myself there had to be something I missed. She looked toward the dark screen. There wasn't. Nobody interrupted. She took a slow breath. I saw your leather vest. Another pause. I saw the Hell's Angels patch. Her eyes met Kyle's. And I decided I already knew who you were. The confession settled over the room. Simple, honest, painful. I convinced myself I was protecting the aircraft. She slowly shook her head. The truth is, I was protecting my own assumptions. Silence answered her. I never checked the reservation, because part of me already believed I wouldn't need to. She looked down at the captain's stripes on her sleeve. I've worn this uniform for 14 years. I always believed those stripes represented good judgment. A faint smile crossed her face. I understand now. They represent responsibility. Kyle nodded once. Thank you for telling the truth. She looked at him. I don't suppose that changes anything. No. His answer was immediate. It doesn't. The room remained still. The independent review will decide what happens next. I won't interfere with it. My title won't protect you. My opinion won't condemn you. He leaned forward slightly. Consequences belong to our actions. Then his voice softened. What comes after those consequences belongs to our choices. Renata listened carefully. You don't get to choose what this review concludes. But you do get to choose who you become after today. Those words stayed with everyone in the room, not because they were dramatic, because they were true. Renata slowly nodded. I understand. Kyle believed she did. The meeting ended quietly. There were no raised voices, no celebration, no victory, only work that needed to begin. Kyle walked down the executive hallway toward a private office where Nora had been waiting. She had fallen asleep on a small sofa, curled around her stuffed dog exactly the way she had done since she was little. The fear from the airplane had finally given way to exhaustion. Kyle stood in the doorway for a moment. He realized children carried pain differently than adults. They trusted the people they loved to make the world safe again. He intended to deserve that trust. He knelt beside the sofa. Nora. Her eyes slowly opened. She smiled the moment she saw him. Hi, Dad. Hi, sweetheart. Is it over? Kyle smiled. The hard part is. She reached for his hand. Can we go home now? We can. Months passed. The independent review examined 6 years of complaints. Every boarding denial, every report of discrimination, every pattern, every employee connected to repeated concerns. Some people received additional training. Some lost positions they should never have kept. Policies changed across the airline. Every denied boarding now required written documentation. Every reservation dispute required verification before removal. Every employee received bias awareness training built around real passenger experiences. The biggest changes happened quietly. A gate agent helped an elderly passenger instead of questioning him. A flight attendant welcomed a construction worker with the same warmth as a business executive. A family wearing motorcycle club colors boarded without a second glance. No whispers, no extra scans, no suspicious looks, just professionalism. Kyle continued flying Summit Pacific exactly as he had promised the board. Sometimes he wore a business suit. Most days he wore the same Hell's Angels vest. Nobody received advance notice. He wanted employees to treat every passenger as though they might be the CEO. More importantly, as though they might not. One afternoon, he boarded another Summit Pacific flight with Nora beside him. The same leather vest, the same worn boots, the same quiet smile. A young flight attendant greeted them. Welcome aboard, Mr. Briggs. She scanned his boarding pass. The light flashed green. She handed it back with a smile. I hope you and your daughter have a wonderful flight. Nothing more, nothing less. Exactly the way every passenger deserved to be treated. Kyle thanked her and took his seat. As the aircraft rolled toward the runway, Nora looked out the window for a long time. She had grown a little older, a little taller. The stuffed dog no longer traveled everywhere, but today she had brought it along anyway. Finally, she looked at her father. Dad. Yes. She thought for a moment. That day, when everybody looked at us like we didn't belong. Kyle waited. Was it worth it? He looked out the window before answering. I've asked myself that question many times. He took her hand. I wish you had never been frightened. I wish no child ever had to feel what you felt that morning. His voice remained calm. But sometimes, the only way to know whether a system is fair is to stand inside it with nothing except your name. He smiled. We could have left angry. Instead, we helped make sure the next father wearing a leather vest doesn't have to prove he belongs before someone believes he does. Nora thought about that. Then she leaned against his shoulder. I'm glad they judged the patch. She smiled. Because they never changed the man wearing it. Kyle looked out across the runway as the aircraft lifted into the sky. Power had never come from the title on his office door. It had come from refusing to become the kind of leader who only understood fairness from the front of the plane. Sometimes, the strongest people aren't the ones who reveal who they are. They're the ones who never have to. If this story reminded you that character matters more than appearance, subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and let us know where you're watching from. Until next time, remember this. Respect is easiest to give when no one has to earn it first.